We're all familiar with the stories of the Torah, stories which form the core of our childhood biblical studies, and they appeal and they captivate young and old alike. Some remain skeptical about the stories, others take them at face value, and still others don't think a whole lot about them, but will certainly take advantage of a worldwide audience and make fortunes off the stories. Hence, Darren Aronofsky's recent Hollywood blockbuster, Noah, Andrew Lloyd Webber's Broadway smash hit, Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat, and of course, for the slightly older generation amongst you, Cecil B. DeMille's role of a lifetime, The Ten Commandments. But to be sure, from a traditional historical perspective, if the Torah is authored by God, which is fundamental, of course, to Jewish belief, then the stories contained therein are real, and of course, they happened. You know, people often ask the question, well, if Moses was given the Torah by God, and in the Torah you have all the stories recorded, well, then how come he didn't get a heads up about things that were going to happen ahead? So in other words, if God told him to write down all the stories, and God, say, for example, told him also that, and then the Jewish people came to the land of Israel and they sent in spies and the spies came back, etc., etc. Well, if you know that as you have given the Torah at Sinai, well before the event occurs, then why send the spies there in the first instance? And yet the point is this: when Moshe receives the Torah at Sinai, God told him to write the Torah and dictated it to him, verbatim, giving him the account and the stories as they had transpired from the beginning of time until his then present. And, of course, at the same time, God also gave him all the many different commandments of the Torah and told him at that point to record all of the commandments as well. Then, as they travel through the desert and the other stories transpire, as they do, at those different intervals thereafter, God tells Moshe to record those stories then as well. And then, of course, also at different intervals to teach the various mitzvot that were already recorded to the Jewish people as they moved along. What comes out from this, however, is the fact that, again, the stories, they are real, they did happen, only it begs one simple question. Why does God want these stories recorded? Mitzvot, morals, values, I get it. That's part and parcel of Jewish living. It tells me how to conduct my life. But Torah is from the root word hora'ah, which means lessons. Obviously, then, if God wants certain stories to be recorded, then he wants that there should be particular lessons. If he wants those stories to be recorded in the same book as the morals and the values, then these stories are also recorded to convey morals, lessons, and values for life. But here's the one fundamental difference. Mitzvahs, they're not open to interpretation. They are what they are. God tells you what you should do. God tells you what you should not do. In fact, some of them may make no sense at face value, hence we have the oral law. So, for example, it says in the Torah, you should make a sign on your head and you should make a sign on your hand. Well, what does that mean? I mean, tattoos are very in vogue today. Why can't I just simply do that? Comes along the oral law and tells me exactly what that sign is in the context of tefillin, etc. Black boxes, square boxes, that they have to be black, and so on and so forth. So often you can't understand a written law without the complementary oral law that is there to clarify various points. The stories, however, in themselves are not really left to interpretation. Again, as we said, they are exactly as they happened, as recorded in God's Torah. But the lessons that we can derive from those stories, that, I suggest you, can already be open to interpretation. The stories are multi-layered. They are filled with nuance and innuendo, and that provides us an opportunity to look at a story and to ask ourselves a simple question: what does this story teach me? How can I learn a life lesson out of this story as it applies to my life, whether in the year 14 or 1814 or 1914 or 2014? And that's what I'm going to do with you right here and now. I'm going to share with you some biblical stories and look at some profound life lessons as they can apply to each of us in our own day-to-day living. And by the way, I'm not talking about dogmatic, hard-hitting religious living. I'm talking about practical living for a healthy and happy lifestyle. So let's take it from the top. The first story that we all know of, the first story of the Torah. The book of Genesis begins with that enthralling and spellbinding story of creation, Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, as told the world over. And that enigmatic tale has captivated the attention of young and old alike through the ages. And that story climaxes on the sixth day of creation, when God brings man and woman into a ready-made world. And he introduces them to the beauty and the grandeur of nature, and he instructs them with basic guiding principles on how to conduct and experience life. Adam and Eve are given one simple instruction. Do not eat from the tree of knowledge. And the behavioral pattern that they will choose in respect of that solitary command will set the course for future consequences for all of the human experience. Do you know the Medrash tells us barely 3 hours had passed between when God gave the directive and man failed miserably in his challenge? And of course, the repercussions and the ramifications of this failure prove calamitous from that initial point in time until present day. Grief, suffering, tribulation, and death, all of life's tragic and painful experiences and consequences, all because of the first negative act committed as a result of human folly. But here's the question. At what point exactly did it all go wrong? What could have possibly gone wrong in such a short period of time to cause such mayhem? And I suggest to you the answer would be a problem that is as prevalent today as it was back then. We refer to it as a lack of communication, the inability to convey a message in the way that it should be expressed. Here's an example of a little nuance in a story that we overlook, but that conveys such an amazing message. Look at the story. When God instructs Adam not to eat from the tree, the Torah says, quote, "And from the tree of good and bad you shall not eat." Read on several verses later, and the snake, the serpent, is challenging Eve as to why she won't eat from the tree. And the Torah says, she replies saying, quote, "And from the tree, the fruit of the tree, which is in the midst of the garden, God said, you shall not eat from it, nor shall you touch it." Where'd that come from? The Medrash explains the discrepancy by telling us that Adam, when communicating God's instruction regarding the tree to his wife, decided of his own accord to add of his own initiative the further suggestion of not touching the tree. Don't even touch it. And it was exactly that which the Medrash says is what the serpent capitalized on. By definition, oh really, you can't touch it? Hey, watch this. And he pushes her against the tree, and she touches the tree. He says, look, see, you survived that. Now go ahead and eat it. You'll survive that too. So what happened over here? Had Adam simply communicated the message verbatim in precisely the same way and manner it was received, none of the subsequent calamities would have ensued. God said, don't eat from the tree. That's all Adam should have repeated over to his wife. But he decided to add in a few extra words, and don't even touch it. You might suggest that it would seem he chose to express the instruction to Eve in a deliberately harsher, more prohibitive manner because he believed that would make for better effect. 2,500 years later, when God gave the Torah to the Jewish people at Sinai, he says, okay, now we're going to do this right. He insisted first that the Torah be communicated to the women and then to the men, because like every woman here in the room will tell you, clearly man cannot be trusted to give over the message to his wife. And in so doing, the Torah makes a deliberate point of telling us. God says to Moshe, so you shall say to the women of Jacob, and so you shall tell the men of Israel. And the rabbis make the observation, say implies a softer form of communication. And tell implies a harsher type of communication. Everybody needs to be spoken to in a manner suitable to their personal temperament. Interestingly enough, no sooner do Adam and Eve eat from the tree, finding them, discovering their own nakedness, and the Torah says God goes looking for Adam. Ayeko, where are you? Was the omnipotent being oblivious to Adam's whereabouts? Certainly not. But rather than confronting him outright, God sought to gently coax Adam from his hiding place. Rather than using the same harsh approach that Adam himself seems to have used when communicating and speaking to Eve, God demonstrated to him the error of his ways and taught him a lesson that must be implemented for all of eternity by slowly coaxing him out. You see, we all tend to speak different languages. And even those of a common native tongue often have problems making themselves understood to one another. In our modern society, we all seem to speak a different kind of language, not just as a result of our different nationalities, maybe also because of our age and gender differences. Much of the malice that we encounter in our contemporary society is in no small measure owing either to our failure of being able to communicate properly with one another, or our inability to convey sentiments and emotions in a manner that can be readily absorbed by the receiving party. One of the leading causes for the breakdown in relationships in contemporary society is because of a lack of communication. When a husband and wife no longer converse on the same level, either because they've forgotten how to speak with the appropriate tenderness, or they simply have stopped bothering to care and listen to what the other person has to say, then the relationship is doomed to failure. One of the foremost reasons for kids drifting from home these days is because there is a lack of communication between parent and child. When parents are out of touch with the rapidly changing trends of modernization and no longer know how to relate to their child, and children are no longer willing to listen to the wise words of experience from their old-fashioned parents, then there is all the more likelihood that the child will seek solace in the impediments which infest our societies in order to compensate for that lack of parental affection. One of the leading causes for assimilation these days is in no small measure because there is a lack of communication. When clergymen and educators have lost touch with how to be able to better convey the beauty of spiritual sentiment over to their students, or they're simply not capable of communicating religious ideals in a sensitive, tactful, and meaningful manner, and frankly, their achievements are lost in their failures. You know, so often I have encountered young adults who have drifted from their roots, blaming an elementary school teacher who simply didn't have the patience for them. Our liberal world today opens up the inquisitive minds of youngsters in a way previously unknown, and difficult questions will invariably be asked. And if that child is going to be stonewalled or met with the classic "ours is not to ask why," then we will likely lose another soul to the engulfing flames of assimilation. You know, there was this elderly man, a Polish Jew who was emigrating from Poland to the United States. And his lawyer friend there in Poland said, "Look, it's very simple, Moshe. When you come to the United States, they're going to ask you 5 questions. Make sure to answer them in order. The first question they'll ask you is, what's your name? You say Moshe Weiss. Then they'll ask you, how many children do you have? You tell them 5. Then they'll ask you, who was the first president of the United States? You tell them George Washington. Then they'll say, how many states are there? You tell them 50. And lastly, they might ask you if you still have your parents. And when they do, you say, Baruch Hashem Beida, thank God both. And so Moshe Weiss makes his way over to the United States. And he comes through to immigration. They take him aside, and the guy takes out his pad. And he says, right, just a couple of questions, and we'll stamp you through. Question number 1, who was the first president of the United States? He says, Moshe Weiss. He says, right, and tell me, how many states are there? He says, 5. And he says, He says, and tell me, what is your name? And he says, George Washington. Right, and how many children do you have? And he says, 50. At which point the immigration officer, who also happened to be Jewish, leaned over to him and said to him in Yiddish, which I'll translate, Zog mir Moshe, tell me Moshe, Wer is mehr meshuggah, mich zu dir? Who's crazier, me or you? And he said, Baruch Hashem beita, thank God, both. You see, you can memorize the lines, you can mutter all kinds of routines, but real words have to be spoken from the heart. Key to success in any relationship is to listen to what the other person is saying, and sometimes even more so to perhaps what is not even being said. Where Adam failed was when he chose to add in those extra words, the harsher type of communication. Real success in communication depends on finding common ground before attempting to redirect the interaction towards a new outcome. The greatest gift that was given to mankind is the ability to speak. It's precisely that which differentiates us from animal. It's precisely that through which our intelligence is actually expressed. And yet, it would seem that this unique trait has also become our greatest nemesis, already dating back to the very, very beginning of time. And the challenge is for us to reverse that trend. The ultimate task and the ultimate ambition of mankind is to bring the world back to that greater utopian state, eradicating all the negativity which ensued as a result of man's first sin. And as it is apparent that that sin originated on account of the fact of a certain lack of communication, then clearly that makes for an ideal starting point, which we all need to look to address in our personal lives, where speaking with love and respect should be employed as a universal language. And only then can we hopefully rediscover the utopian bliss that life has to offer. That brings us into the story of Noah. Who cannot but help and be intrigued by the story of Noah? I mean, it doesn't matter how many times you read the story, year on year. There's always certain questions and enigmas that remain outstanding, like where on earth did they keep the woodpeckers and the termites on a wooden ark? Or is it really feasible, for example, to imagine that the chickens survived? I mean, there were 4 Jewish women on board, 40 days and nights of rain. Somebody must have some chicken soup. Mind you, this is true, I'll never forget, I mean, it made me realize how old I am when my 5-year-old asked me, she says to me, Tati, were you on Noah's ark? And I said, no, and then she said to me, well, then how did you survive the flood? It's a question. It's a story that is filled with intrigue and suspense. It's filled with tragedy and triumph. We look to Noah, on the one hand, as a hero, the only upright citizen, the only man of moral standing in a world that has gone completely mad. But on the other hand, we're left with a certain sense of despair when observing how he couldn't save even one other solitary soul. We're struck by the harshness of the divine decree of a flood wiping out the world, but also reassured by God's promise that it'll never occur again. And although it's a fascinating piece of history, it leaves us spellbound each and every time. And we can learn, again, certain clear lessons from that story as it can be applied into the practical realms of our personal lives. 5 short lessons. 6 rather. Number 1, don't miss the boat. You know, there are 3 types of people. Those who make things happen, those who watch things happen, and those who wonder what happened. People have a tendency to procrastinate. People like to watch the mountain without ever climbing it. But today's opportunity is yesterday's dream and tomorrow's memory. God made a deliberate point of telling Noah to take his time in building the ark. 120 years. Why? So as to be able to allow other people to come along to question, what are you doing? And then he would tell them, and then they would hopefully look to mend their ways, to give them a chance as it presented itself. But alas, as we know, it ultimately still only was Noah and his family that made it onto the boat. Nobody else joined in. Opportunity is missed by most people because it's dressed in overalls and it looks like work. Is it conceivable that over all of that time Noah didn't perk anybody's interests? Or can we more likely assume that there may well have been those who may have stood up and taken notice, but then they have to think about the work involved in changing something about their lives, in overhauling their characters, in trying to redefine their creature habits. It's overwhelming. I don't want to have to bother to change myself. So they'd rather simply be left alone. They'd rather just simply go with the flow, roll the dice, and see wherever life will take them. And of course, as a result, they all miss the boat. You know, the verse in Proverbs puts it in perspective when telling us, a wise youth makes hay whilst the sun shines, but what a shame to see a lad who sleeps away his hour of opportunity. That's lesson number one. Lesson number two, don't forget we're all in the same boat. What was the cardinal sin of that generation? They didn't get along with each other. They disrespected one another. They stole from one another. They were unfaithful to each other. And what was the principal sin of the next generation that followed after the flood? They tried to build this Tower of Babylon, in which they tried to wage war against God. And what was their punishment? They weren't destroyed. Ultimately, their punishment simply was that they were dispersed throughout the land. What's the difference between the two stories? Well, in the second story, you wage war, you want to start up with God. You know what? He can get over it. But when you can't get along with one another, when you don't realize that we're all in the same boat, that's something that is more disturbing to God than anything else. When you offend his people, his creatures, well, as moms and dads, what hurts you more? When someone upsets you or when someone offends your kids? The great tragedy of our day is discord. From time immemorial, we always proved the greatest risk to ourselves was when we lacked unity. The Talmud observes the first temple was destroyed because, again, of idolatry. Starting up with God. We were in exile for 70 years. The second temple was destroyed because of baseless hatred. And we're still in exile, suffering the consequences as a result. These two temples parallel those two eras of the post-flood, pre-flood, and post-flood. It's only when we fully appreciate that Ashkenaz, Sephard, Oriental, Occidental, Hasidic, Litvish, Orthodox, Reform, we are all in the same boat. And only when we act in accordance with that awareness, then whether high tides or low tides of life, we can withstand whatever torments life might throw our way. Lesson number 3, when we get right down to it, of the things which matter most in life is your family. You know, our pursuits and ambitions in life often take precedence to the family that we build around us. I know it sometimes hurts to hear that, but life dictates that we spend more hours in the workplace than we do at home. We dedicate more time thinking about our boss or our clients than we necessarily do about our kids. We spend more time talking to colleagues than we do to our spouses. And it's intriguing how the Torah feels the need to highlight how Noach's middle son, Ham, turned out to be so rebellious. On the one hand, you'd think all the many years that Noach is spending building the ark would have prompted him some kind of conversation. Hey, Dad, what you doing? I'm building an ark. God, this, that, and the other, whatever it is. And yet maybe Noach became so preoccupied with his building and attending to his job, his ark, that there really wasn't enough time for the whole family. Lesson number 4. Don't listen to the critics. Just get on with what has to be done. One of the biggest frustrations in life is when one sets their mind to doing something only for their objectives to get shot down by others. Maybe some mean it in a constructive sense, but there are others, plenty of others, who always look to disparage if only because they know that you're right. And it's a problem that exists as much in the heart as it does in the soul. By definition, there will often be people who will look to impede your material progress, whilst there are others who sometimes look to mock your spiritual aspirations. Over the many years that Noah spent building the ark, he faced all kinds of scorn and ridicule. At one stage, we're told that they sought to try and come along and demolish the ark. Many people lack the courage to pursue religious aims or the conviction to follow their dreams because, like they say in Yiddish, was jenem wird sagen, what somebody else is going to say, for fear of scorn. And nothing could be more crippling for personal growth. The first thing that Code of Jewish Law tells us before even introducing us to the actual laws themselves is do not be intimidated by those who seek to ridicule. All too often, the truth hurts, and sometimes the intensity of the scorn in and of itself proves to you how you're probably on to something. Noah teaches us that real success is the ability to build a firm foundation from the bricks that others throw at you. Ignore your critics, go out there and build your ark. Number 5, this is one that we're all familiar with. Remember, the ark was built by amateurs, the Titanic was built by professionals. There is a fine balance that we all have to find in life, where on the one hand we must be aware of our personal talents so that we can best apply them to our life's plan and model, but never to the point of believing yourself invincible or indispensable. Self-esteem and humility are not paradoxical. There's no contradiction. You have to believe in yourself, because if you don't, how are you going to expect anyone else to believe in you? You have to have faith in your own abilities. Without a humble but reasonable confidence in your own powers, you cannot be successful or happy. Most of all, believe in yourself because God believes in you. Know that what you achieve is because of your capacity and genius, which are in fact divine gifts that were handed to you, with which you are intended to make your difference. Noah, Abraham, Moshe, and all others, they all cast initial doubt on their missions with which they were charged. Surely they knew that when being presented with a divine task, they would prevail. But they had sufficient humility to realize that no man nor mission is unsinkable, and that ultimately it is only with God's help and guidance that we remain buoyant in life. And finally, number 6, no matter what the storm, when God is with you, there's always a rainbow waiting. It's a fact. Life is filled with trials and tribulations, where sometimes we see God through the haze, and at other times the density of the darkness distorts our vision, leading to despondency. In fact, when the deadline came and was reached, and reality started to dawn, even Noah, the Torah tells us, started to entertain doubts before embarking. And it was only when God forced him into the ark through the actual floodwaters that he acquiesced. When we confront challenges of whatever sort, we can be so overwhelmed with emotion and therefore resistant to lucid analysis. And when doing that, you invariably result in drowning in the floods of doubt and despair. But with God at your side or at the helm, we understand that nothing in life is black and white, but rather more complex, like the multicolors of a rainbow. We acknowledge our ordeals as part of life's challenges, and we become more motivated to look answers, to explore our relationships with God, and to look to grow from the experience. The Talmud tells us God never overimposes upon his creation, which means that if God needs to bring a challenge into this world for reasons known only to him, then he will pick somebody whom he will recognize as special and perfectly capable of dealing with those challenges. So when you wonder, why me? It's because you have what it takes. Rise to the challenge and reap the vast rewards which beckon. There's a pot of gold awaiting at the end. So you see, the story of Noah demonstrates more than simply how to survive bad weather in an animal-packed boat built without power tools, air conditioning, and indoor plumbing. It's a lesson for life, which is often like paddling upstream. If you don't advance, then you're going to draw back. And even when you are in deep water, if you tread hard enough, you'll always be able to properly stay afloat. Lech Lecha, the story of Avraham. Let me reassure you, we're not going to go through the whole Bible. Lech Lecha and Vayera, let's just throw them two together, the next two portions, because they essentially tell us the life of Abraham. Beyond the obvious lessons that we know about Abraham and what he teaches us about love and kindness and benevolence, there's a more compelling lesson as it relates very much to our 21st century. You know, in the times of Abraham, there was the very first ever real recession. Vayihi ra'av ba'aretz, says the Torah, there was a famine in the land. And then the verse reiterates, Ra'av kaved me'od. It was a very heavy land. The hunger was especially severe. No food, no economy, market meltdown, to use modern jargon. And several verses later, we read how Abraham had amassed immense wealth. So did Lot, his nephew. And then thereafter, we read about how Abraham manages to somehow retain his wealth, but Lot loses it all. He escapes from Sodom with just barely the shirt on his back. And here again, what's this Torah conveying that story to us for? Because when you look at the story and you contrast the attitudes between Abraham and Lot, you develop an understanding of what your attitude should be towards monetary pursuits, money, and so forth. The Torah tells us regarding Abraham and Lot, they were not able to coexist. Why not? Well, there were some practical, economical problems, but there was also some ideological differences. Twice, the Torah says, they could not coexist. Once, because of the practical reality that they both had immense amounts of cattle and there simply wasn't enough land in which to graze in. And the second time, because of the ideological concerns. Namely, Abraham's cattle were all muzzled. But Lot's cattle, well, they went grazing in other people's fields. And that caused a lot of friction. But Lot didn't care. I'll take what I can. Greed. What I can, where I can, when I can. And yet, curiously, the Torah tells us that when they left Egypt, it says again that Abraham accumulated a lot of cattle, and it says Lot accumulated a lot of cattle, and here again, the little nuance, and also tents. V'gam ohalim. What's the relevance of that? Why do I have to get an account or more detail about what Lot had over and above what Abraham had? And yet I suggest to you the following. The families, they're traveling. At this point, they're not settled anywhere just yet. Yes, cattle you schlep with you from point A to point B. Even as you're traveling, you take your herd with you, whether for food, for trade, or what have you. But what on earth does Lot need with a bunch of tents? When you settle wherever you might be settling, then you acquire tents to settle in. Why does he have to take them with him now on his journey from Egypt back to the land of Canaan? And yet I think it's a further example of demonstrating to us about his mindset. It was just about, again, accumulating what you can, while you can, however you can. You know, they tell the story of a very spoiled girl. So spoiled, she always got whatever she wanted. She truly believed the world was hers for the picking. And so she goes to her rabbi one day and she says, Rabbi, oi, I'm once again so spoiled for choice. Both Chaim and Moshe love me. Tell me, Rabbi, which one do you think will marry me? Who's going to be the lucky one? To which the rabbi replied, Chaim will probably marry you. Moshe will be the lucky one. Lucky indeed is the one who knows how to keep life in balance and doesn't always feel the need to relentlessly pursue every conquest. And that's why, again, we read immediately afterwards how Lot chooses to go down to Sodom, a land known for its greed and its gluttony. And consider again carefully the wording of the verse that introduces us to the city of Sodom. And it says the people there were ra'im b'chatoim. They were evil and they were sinners. And Rashi, the commentator par excellence, makes a deliberate point of telling us. They were evil with their bodies and sinners with their money. With their bodies, they were unfaithful to one another. But what defines them as sinners? The money, the excess, the overindulgence. Because like with every overindulgence, when you shift away from the middle of the road balance, you end up closer to the gutter. And the end result of this, of course, is destruction. And it was in a very real sense. And for the rest of us, in our context, what the last number of years have proven, is that excessive borrowing to finance extreme desires to have more, that's what leads to recession. In the end, Sodom was destroyed because that's what greed and excess gets you to. All too often, people relentlessly pursue. They may worship the material, the next conquest, the incessant demands to spend more and more, to acquire more and more, and others get hurt in the process, and there's something wrong with that cycle. What are our priorities in life? Of course, you'll say, my family, my friends, and yet too many, when forced to choose between their money and their lives, well, in the Shema, we say you should love God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your might, which we understand to mean all your money. If you're already told to love God with all your soul, which means to give up your life for the sake of God, then why thereafter does it have to say, and you should also love God with all your money? Isn't that a given, says the Talmud? No, some people would rather give their life rather than their money. If there's one lesson that Avraham teaches us, and events of the past years have taught us, is that you cannot rely on material wealth for happiness and security. That takes us into the portion in the story of Chayei Sarah, where the Torah tells us about the passing of Abraham's wife, Sarah. And here again, a very important lesson for life, because the Torah makes a deliberate point of telling us, curiously and seemingly unnecessary, about Abraham's emotional response. Says the Torah, and Abraham came to eulogize Sarah and to cry over her. And that one sentence encapsulates the faithful response whenever we encounter whatever kind of loss or adversity in life. People mistakenly assume that the righteous just simply graciously accept everything that happens to them. And yet, Abraham, he who discovered God of his own accord, he who had a constant communication with God, he cried upon his wife's passing. You know, Elie Wiesel, who endured the depths of despair in Auschwitz, he summed it up thus: you can either love God or you can be angry and hate God, but you can't ignore God. By definition, if you use the concept of human suffering to deny the existence of God that you otherwise previously believed in, that's a logical absurdity. Why? Well, it's tantamount to saying, if I don't grasp Einstein's theory of relativity, then it must be flawed. It doesn't follow logically that my inability to comprehend means the system is flawed. I can be upset, I can be frustrated, but I can't deny reality. That would be an emotional response, not a rational one. Hence, you can love God. In other words, you can be super like Abraham was and still somehow accept irrespective. Or you could be upset with God. You can be angry with him, frustrated about the situation, but logically, whatever brought you into the acceptance of God's reality in the first instance cannot be rejected outright in the face of whatever challenge or adversity. To be sure, every individual reserves the right to introspect in the face of personal tragedy, but never at the expense of despairing and giving up. You know, a farmer owned a horse which one day ran away. And all the townsfolk came to the farmer and said, you know, we're sorry about your loss. And he said, I don't know, maybe it's a bad thing, maybe it's a good thing. And a little while later, his horse returned with a bunch of wild horses in tow, and all the people came to congratulate him on his newfound wealth. And he said, I don't know, maybe it's a good thing, maybe it's a bad thing. One day his son went riding out on one of the wild horses and he fell off and he broke his leg, and the people came and said, we're sorry this happened. And he said, I don't know, maybe it's a bad thing, maybe it's a good thing. And then a little while later, the town, the country went to war, and all the able-bodied young men were conscripted into the military, except of course the farmer's son couldn't go because he had a broken leg. And the farmer said, now I know that when my horse ran away, it was a good thing. Life is a series of events where sometimes you might see the end result here and now. Other times, in fact, most often, you won't see it until the hereafter. If in the process you can still love God, then all the power to you. If you get angry with God, He understands. But key here is that you can't ignore God. As in the words of the famous Kotzker Rebbe, a God I can understand is a God not worth believing in. But how then do we respond in the interim? Are we just simply supposed to be martyrs and blindly accept whatever God throws at us? Well, that brings us back to Abraham's own response, who cried over his wife's passing. The Torah makes a deliberate point of telling us this in order to demonstrate that even the most faithful of human beings are, after all, human beings. And notwithstanding Abraham's extreme faith, of course he feels the pain. This was his wife, the love of his life, and it rips at his heart. Doesn't God, after all, command us to sit 7 days of mourning, God forbid, after the passing of a loved one? Because part and parcel of God's perfection is that he is a compassionate God. He created us as human beings, limited to the confines of time and space, with limited understanding. And to that end, he doesn't look to deny us our natural instincts. On the contrary, he expects us to express them. But there is a condition. Even as Abraham cries, the Torah writes the Hebrew word, vilifkota, and to cry over her, again a little nuance, with the letter kaf, vilifkota, smaller than the rest of the letters, when you look in the Torah scroll. And that's there to demonstrate that whilst it was a natural grief, it was also a controlled grief. It was deep upset, but it wasn't despair. It was Abraham being a human being with a touch of divinity. I'm sorry that this happened. I'm pained that this happened. But I also know that ultimately there is a reason for this to have happened. You know, there's a rabbi sitting next to an elderly woman on a plane, and the plane suddenly hits this heavy turbulence, and she looks to the rabbi and she says, "You're a man of the cloth, do something." And the rabbi looks to her and says, "Lady, I'm in sales, not management." The one analogy, perhaps more than any other, that we should always remember in this context is the mother who takes her young child to the doctor. And as the mother wrestles the child and holds him down, kicking and screaming, the doctor administers a needle. We've all been through that process, through that experience. The child walks away resenting the doctor, and he never wants to go back. But when he's that much older, he finds himself sometimes willingly going back to the doctor. And sometimes he can be seen actually begging the doctor to give him an injection. What changed? It's the same doctor. It's the same needle. But the patient has changed. He's matured, and with maturity comes a different perspective. And moreover still, even at that infantile stage, that same mother who held that child down and served as an accomplice to the crime of the injection is the same mother who the child grabs hold of after the event for consolation and comfort. Because somewhere deep down, even if only in the subconscious, the child knows this is part of a process and mom still loves me. At every funeral, we declare that God is absolute justness and perfection. There's a reason for every loss as it transpires. Job declared that somehow in the Messianic age, we will actually thank God for the suffering endured during our exiled state. But up until that point, at present, we, in our current state of exile, are commanded to grieve in the face of every calamity, but at the same time to understand, for your thoughts are not my thoughts, says the Lord. Can't quite speculate over the terrible things as they may happen, but rather to embrace the Talmudic dictum, teach yourself to say, I do not know, and then ultimately just yearn for a better tomorrow. Toldos. Got a few minutes left. We're introduced to the offspring of Yitzchak, 2 sons, Jacob and Esau. Isn't it astounding to observe how from time immemorial our ancestors grappled in dealing with their children's diverse personalities? Abraham had 2 sons. He had Yitzchak, who proved himself such a wonderful source of nachas, and he had Ishmael, who gave Abraham sleepless nights. Yitzchak had 2 sons, Yaakov, who was a chip off the old block, and Esau, who of course brought ridicule and scorn on the family's good name. Yaakov had 12 sons. And of course, there was the terrible sibling rivalry where he favored Joseph over the others, and we know everything that ensued as a result, generating so much heartache and despair. Maybe Abraham was, like we mentioned earlier, too preoccupied with his mission of converting the outside world that he neglected, even if only somewhat, what was going on in his own home environment. A not too uncommon problem in many rabbinic or professional homes today. You know, children crave attention. They want to know that they rate right up there and that they are as important on their parents' list of priorities, not slotted in for some spare time when clients aren't calling. When the drone of "not right now" or "ask me later" is constantly echoing in the child's ear, then there can well come a point where that child goes deaf to the call of moral standing and their parents' subsequent anguished cries. Yitzchak probably only knew of one approach and looked to persuade Esau to embrace it, only to meet with proportional resistance. It's easy to find fault with our kids, especially when you're in pursuit of the golden child. But you know what? We were once children as well. And maybe we think we're more perfect than we perceive our children to be. But then again, in all likelihood, our parents probably thought the same when dealing with us. We look to mold our children, but always we must be aware of whatever particular limitations. Yaakov, maybe he was driven by, guilt over the loss of his young beloved Rachel. And therefore he looked to smother her children with added love, and in the process alienating all the others. All children need to feel love. Love isn't divided, love is multiplied, even if that means that you love each child differently. And that love begins at home and is not determined by how much we do for our children, but by how much love we put into what we do for them. I tell about these two young Jewish brothers, so disobedient, real rogues, that they're bounced from pillar to post and kicked out of every single Jewish school. So the parents have no alternative but to enroll them in some Catholic reformatory school, known for its zero tolerance of misbehavior. And the younger brother is waiting down the hall while the older brother is sitting in the office of the principal, a big burly priest, who looks at him and says to him, "Young man, where is God?" And the boy looks down, shifts uneasily, and says not a word. He says, "Young man, I ask you a question. Where is God?" And the boy starts to shift more in his seat, looking side to side, doesn't respond. At which point this principal, this big burly priest, comes menacingly from around the side of his desk, stands towering over the young boy sitting on the chair and says, "Young man, I'm going to ask you one more time. Where is God?" At which point the boy picks himself out of his chair, runs out of the office, goes running down the hall, runs bang smack into his brother and says, what is it, man?" He goes, "We got to get out of here. They lost God and they're blaming us." In the last century, parents were known to be too strict with their kids. In today's day and age, parents are guilty of being too lenient. We're struggling constantly and somehow trying to get the balance right. But one thing we should always remember, inasmuch as we're looking at our children to see what they're doing with their lives, they are watching us to see what we are doing with ours. And therefore, sometimes when we're looking to focus on our children's behavior, we can't isolate it, but we have to look at the bigger picture and consider what we're doing and how we're conducting ourselves and how they might perceive that and how that is impacting on their own behavior. It's said there's only one way to bring up kids right. Just nobody knows what it is. But the one lesson that I like to take with me through life as a parent emanates from a little sign, I mentioned this yesterday, that still hangs on my mother's kitchen. Children need love, especially when they don't deserve it. And more of us need to embrace that message as we strive to raise the next generation. Vayetze. Yaakov has two wives, Rachel and Leah. Is there anything more beautiful in life than a boy and girl clasping clean hands and pure hearts in the path of marriage? Can there be anything more beautiful than young love? Well, a careful analysis of the portion sheds some light for the answer as well, because we're told about the adventures of Jacob as he leaves his father's home and as he heads out to find a bride. And as the story unfolds, Jacob falls in love with Rachel, the younger of Laban's two daughters, and he agrees to work for her for 7 years. And after the 7 years, we know the story, Laban, true to his cunning self, switches Rachel for the older daughter Leah, and just prior to the wedding ceremony, Jacob, who is insistent of marrying Rachel, of course, gives her some special signs, knowing that his uncle might dupe him, and she, of course, hands off the signs to her older sister. In the end, he agrees to work another 7 years to marry Rachel as well. Right at the outset, when introducing us to the two girls, Rachel and Leah, the Torah says, "And the eyes of Leah were weak, and Rachel was exceptionally beautiful. And then the Torah continues and says, and Jacob loved Rachel more than Leah. Now, when you look at that for the first time, Leah's eyes were weak, Rachel was beautiful, and Jacob loved Rachel more than Leah. What do you think? I mean, it's just a disturbing statement. Is the Torah granting legitimacy to just the shallow exterior? Is the Torah simply contrasting one with not such nice eyes with another who was beautiful? And what are we to make of Jacob's character? Was he so superficial that he loved Rachel because she was beautiful, but not Leah because her eyes were not pretty? That's the seeming message being conveyed. But again, we've got to look at the story. We've got to analyze the nuance, the innuendo. We've got to understand, why is the Torah telling us that Leah's eyes were weak? And the answer is because people would say that Rebekah had 2 sons and Laban had 2 daughters. So the older, Leah, will marry the older, Esau, and the younger, Rachel, will marry the younger, Jacob. And that perturbed Leah so much, the idea, the suggestion constantly of her maybe having to marry Esau, that she would cry all of the time. And that's what resulted in her eyes becoming weak. And the suggestion is that maybe that reflects a certain kind of subtle selfishness in Leah's character. One of the reasons suggested for the kidnapping later of Leah's daughter Dinah was as punishment because Jacob concealed Dinah in a box, rather than allowing the opportunity for her to marry Esau, because the woman is the foundation of the Jewish home. And rather than being concerned that somehow Esau will corrupt her, she will have been the one to have the necessary impact and transform Esau. So there's something, that little, yes, of course, I get it. Leah's upset. She doesn't want to marry Esau. But to cry so persistently, so incessantly, to the point where her eyes simply become weak, reflects a certain kind of selfishness on her part. Because for all we know, yes, she would have ultimately been able to have the same sort of effect on Esau as well. Granted, she's perturbed, but not looking at the broader perspective implies a certain kind of selfishness. Whereas let's contrast that with Rachel, who, like we said, is now ready to marry the love of her life. And instead of exposing her father's scam, she chooses to spare her sister embarrassment and gives her the signs and forgoes, without knowing, that Yaakov would necessarily marry her again thereafter. You know, eyes are the windows of the soul. Even the Talmud says you can look into a bride's eye and know everything about her. Jacob sees in Leah's weak eyes a certain element of selfishness which is hardly the ideal for marriage. Rachel, on the other hand, was very beautiful. She epitomized altruism. Thus, Jacob loved Rachel. There was immediate attraction where he recognized that she, like him, would be the ideal partners to raise the 12 tribes and pave the way for the Jewish future. Every marriage is a selfless act, where each partner is taking their lives until then entirely their own and looking to commit it to the other. But in the process, people mistakenly assume that marriage is a give-and-take relationship. There can be no bigger misconception than that. Marriage is a give-and-give relationship. The difference is if it's a give-and-take, then you're giving and you're always wondering what you're receiving in return, keeping one eye on what you get back. When it's a give-and-give, you'll both invariably be receiving as well, but in a totally selfless framework. Just remember this, and we'll wind up with this. You know, we are, in the context of relationships, diametric opposites. A language instructor was once explaining to her class that in French, nouns, unlike their English counterparts, are grammatically designated as masculine or feminine. So house in French is la maison. Pencil in French is le crayon. Somebody asked the question, so what is a computer? Is it la or le? Is it masculine or feminine? So the teacher divided up the class between the men and the women and told them to come back with an answer after an hour. And they did. The men came back after the hour and they said a computer is definitely feminine. La, computer. Why? Because no one but their creator understands their internal logic. Because the native language they use to communicate with other computers is incomprehensible to everyone else. Because every mistake is stored in long-term memory for possible later retrieval. And because no sooner do you acquire one, you realize if only you waited a little longer, no sooner you acquire one, you realize you end up having to spend half your paycheck on accessories for it. The women's group, however, concluded that a computer must be masculine. Why? Because you talk to them and they never respond. Because they have a lot of data but they're still clueless. Because they're supposed to help you solve the problem, but half the time they are the problem. And because no sooner do you require one and you realize that if you waited a little longer, you would have got a better model. All of life is a process, a pursuit of bringing our lives back to that utopian state where we can merge again to become one in the way that Adam and Eve were created from one entity. And the only way to achieve that is through selflessness, through self-abnegation, through removing oneself from the equation and making room for the other. Like the story told about the rabbi who went with his wife to the doctor and he said, "Rabbi, my wife's leg is hurting us." Is something more beautiful than young love? Yes. It's the spectacle of an older man and an older woman finishing their journey together on that same path. Their hands are bent, but still clasped. Their faces are wrinkled, but still radiant. Their hearts are tired, but still strong with love and devotion for one another. The only thing more beautiful than young love is old love. And that's the message that Yaakov communicates with his two wives. So here we have it, some of the stories. There are, of course, many more, teaching us the lessons for life, for marriage, for child rearing, from communication to our attitude to money, from coping with adversity and how to stay buoyant in the floods of life. Come back next year and we'll continue with some more. Thank you.
If you liked that video, hit the subscribe button and notification bell below for hours of the best Jewish content online.